In the spring of 2003, a county extension hydrologist named Dale Pruitt drove his white university pickup down a long caliche road in Meade County, Kansas, and told a 32-year-old widow named Nora Hess that her well was done. He was polite about it. He had charts. He said the Ogallala aquifer under her 500 acres had dropped below economic threshold, and that modern pump technology could not keep pace with recharge rates at her depth. He told her, in the patient tone of a man who had given this speech before, that her best course was to switch to dry land wheat, or sell the parcel to one of the larger operations to the north, who had access to a shared canal. He used the phrase honest advice twice. Nora listened. She thanked him. She watched his pickup raise a plume of dust going back toward the highway. 9 years later, in the dry August of 2012, when the worst drought in 6 decades turned the conventional fields of Meade County into cracked gray plates, and the county average wheat yield fell to 11 bushels per acre, Nora Hess pulled 38.6 bushels per acre from that same ground. She did not use the canal. She did not switch to dryland wheat. She drilled one well. It was not the well Dale Pruitt had in mind. This is the story of the 9 years in between. The Hess place had been in the family since 1947, when Nora's grandfather, Carl Hess, filed on the ground after coming back from the Pacific, with nothing but a discharge paper and a head full of what he'd seen Kansas soil do in dry years and what it could do if you treated it differently. He farmed it for 30 years the way his father had farmed the 40 acres they'd lost in the 30s, which is to say with a deep suspicion of any single approach and a calendar that ran closer to the moon and the grass than to the commodity board. Carl's son, Nora's father, kept it going in the 80s, barely. When Nora married Jake Hess at 26, she married into the land as much as into the man, and she understood that distinction before she was 29. Jake died of a cardiac event in October of 2002, 11 days after the wheat was planted. He was 36 years old. He left Nora the 500 acres, a Case tractor in reasonable condition, $40,000 in operating debt, and a well that had been struggling since the summer previous. His life insurance, after the debt was settled, left her with $11,000 and the ground itself. She kept a cattle dog named Cobb, a red heeler with one torn ear, who had come with the marriage and stayed with the land. Cobb was 5 years old in 2002, and he slept across the door of the farmhouse every night that first winter, as if he understood that his job had changed. Dale Pruitt arrived in April. He was 47, lean and precise, a hydrologist with Kansas State Extension who had spent 2 decades measuring aquifer decline across the western counties. He was not a bad man. He had published 3 papers on Ogallala depletion, and he believed, with genuine conviction, that the data he carried in his folder represented the most honest service he could offer a widow in a difficult position. He set the folder on her kitchen table and walked her through the drawdown curve, the recharge rate, the pump efficiency numbers. He spoke about the economics of irrigation in the present tense, which is to say the economics of scale, volume, and cost per acre inch. "You're not a bad farmer," he told her, which was the kindest wound in the conversation. "The ground is not the problem. The water table is simply not going to support this operation at competitive yield. I've seen this play out on a dozen places in the last 10 years. Nora asked him one question. She asked what the clay lens looked like at 380 feet. Pruitt looked at his folder. Then he looked at her. Then he said that was not a standard survey depth for that formation, and that his data did not extend to that interval. She thanked him, and he drove away. Let me tell you about the thing Nora had found in her grandfather's desk. Carl Hess had kept 2 drawers of field journals, the kind with the cardboard cover going back to 1949. Most farmers who kept notes kept yield logs and precipitation records. Carl had kept those, but he had also kept something else, a running observation season by season of what happened when it rained hard on the eastern third of his ground versus the western third, and what the grass told him 2 weeks after. He had noted, in the spring of 1961 and again in 1969, that the eastern parcel stayed green 3 weeks longer than the western parcel after the last meaningful rain. He wrote, in his careful schoolteacher hand, that this was not drainage. He had checked drainage. He wrote that he believed there was a perched formation, a separate water-bearing layer sitting above the Ogallala, recharged by runoff from the small ridge to the northeast, and that it sat, by his estimate from the old driller's log he had kept from 1951, somewhere between 300 and 400 feet on the east side. Carl had never drilled for it. The main well, at 220 feet, had served him adequately in the wet decades. He had simply written down what he observed and left it in the drawer for whoever came after him. Nora found the journals in January of 2003, 3 months before Pruitt arrived. She read all 32 of them in 5 evenings at the kitchen table under the lamp that Jake had wired himself. She had grown up watching this ground. She knew the eastern third. She had noticed the same thing Carl noticed and had never named it. The journals named it for her. What Carl had documented across those 32 journals was not a theory. It was a record. It was the kind of record you can only produce by being in one place long enough that the anomalies start to accumulate into a pattern. He had noted the grass color differential in 1961 without explanation, simply recorded it as a fact, the way a careful person records a fact they do not yet understand. In 1969, he had returned to the same observation and added a single line in the margin, same as the other time. By the 1970s, he had begun walking the boundary of the green zone after a dry stretch, measuring it with his stride, marking the approximate edge with a surveying pin. He was not a scientist. He was a man who had been burned by the Dust Bowl's lessons as a child and had decided that the land would tell you things if you were quiet enough to receive them. Nora had read the journals twice through before she called anyone. The second reading was the slower one, where she was looking not just for what Carl had observed, but for what he had decided based on the observation. He had decided not to till the ridge. He had decided to run his cow-calf pairs on the eastern pasture, in the dry months rather than the western, because the eastern ground recovered faster. He had decided, in 1974, not to deepen the main well when a neighbor suggested it, writing in his journal that he preferred to leave the deep formation unperturbed until he knew more about it. He never knew more about it. He left the knowing to her. After Pruitt left, she contacted a private well contractor named Ed Ferris, who operated out of Liberal, and had drilled in the Meade County formation for 26 years. She asked him what he thought about a perched lens at depth on a northeast drainage parcel. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he had hit one of those on a parcel about 8 miles east in 1987, and it had produced at 12 gallons per minute for 19 years before it was overtapped. He asked her why she was asking. She told him about the journals. Ed Ferris drove out and walked the eastern third with her on a Tuesday in May. He looked at the ridge. He walked the grass line. He dug a probe into the soil in 3 places and examined the color at depth. He charged her nothing for the visit and said she was either very right or she had just wasted a visit from an old man. She drilled in June of 2003. The contract was $22,000 for a 400-foot well all in, with the understanding that if they came up dry, she owed the full amount, and that was the end of it. They hit the lens at 382 feet. It produced at 14 gallons per minute. 14 gallons per minute is not a flood. It is not the yield of a high-capacity municipal well or a shared canal. Let me tell you what 14 gallons per minute actually means on 500 acres of Kansas ground when it is managed with a specific discipline. Ed Ferris had one further observation when the driller's log came in. The formation Nora had struck was what drillers call a confined aquifer, meaning it was sealed above and below by impermeable clay, which meant it did not lose water to evaporation and was not directly connected to the surface depletion that had reduced the main Ogallala system. It recharged from a different source, the fracture drainage from the Limestone Ridge Formation to the northeast, which meant that as long as the ridge held its topsoil and its native grass cover, the lens would continue to receive recharge. The enemy of that well was not drought. The enemy of that well was tillage on the ridge. Nora owned the ridge. It was 40 acres of rough native grass ground that her grandfather had never broken out because the slope made equipment work difficult and the grass itself held the soil that fed the creek that fed the low spots that made the eastern pasture work. Carl had refused 3 offers to sell those 40 acres in the 1970s. Pruitt's survey had not assessed the ridge because it was not irrigated cropland and therefore not within the scope of his drawdown analysis. To Pruitt, those 40 acres were unproductive. To the water in the formation below, they were the source. What Nora understood from the journals and from her own years on that ground was that the management of one piece of land was the management of a system. You could not farm the eastern third without protecting the ridge, and you could not protect the ridge without understanding why Carl had refused to sell it. The journals explained why. The confined aquifer explained why. Pruitt's folder, which was accurate about everything it measured, had not measured any of this. The CTA window opens here naturally, and it is worth a breath. If you have ever watched a piece of ground long enough to notice something a survey missed, leave that in the comments. This is what this channel is for. The question in 2003, after the well came in, was what to do with 14 gallons per minute across 500 acres. The answer was not to irrigate 500 acres. The answer was to irrigate the 80 acres of ground with the best soil profile, using a drip and subsurface system that delivered water directly to the root zone with minimal evaporative loss, and to leave the remaining 420 acres in a combination of dryland winter wheat and native grass, managed as a rotation that kept residue on the soil through the hot months. Nora spent the summer of 2003 researching drip irrigation systems and talking to a grower in the Texas Panhandle named Armando Vega, who had run subsurface drip on vegetable ground for 11 years. Armando had converted 40 acres of peppers and onions in 1991, spending the first 3 years learning what his mistakes were, and he told Nora that the critical decision was emitter depth and spacing, that you were not trying to wet the whole soil profile. You were trying to intercept the root where it was going to go. And if you understood where your crop's root went in your specific soil, you had done most of the thinking already. He talked to her for nearly 2 hours one July evening and told her that the first year would teach her more than the next 5, and that the mistakes she made in year 1 were tuition, not failure, and she should budget for them accordingly. Armando had not run drip on grain crops. Hard red winter wheat was new territory, and he referred her to an agronomist in Lubbock who had done some drip work on small grain trials, which led to 2 more telephone conversations and a reading list that Nora worked through in the evenings that August. The core principle that emerged from all of it was consistent. Drip irrigation's advantage in grain production was not higher peak yields. It was the elimination of the variable. A well-managed drip system could deliver reliable moisture at depth across a season regardless of rainfall pattern, which meant that the crop's performance was limited by soil quality and genetics rather than by weather timing. On a heritage wheat variety whose genetics had been selected across 70 years for dry year performance, removing the weather variable did not merely stabilize yield. It unlocked the variety's potential in ways that rainfall-dependent production had never allowed. She understood the installation cost was significant. She calculated it against the cost of keeping the operation alive versus the alternative, which was selling the parcel for what she could get and moving to Dodge City to do something else. The calculation was not close. She borrowed $38,000 from the Farm Credit Office in Meade against the improved value of the property, installed the subsurface drip system on the 80 acres with emitter lines running at 16-inch depth and 30-inch spacing, and planted them in August of 2003 to a heritage, hard red winter wheat variety she had found in Carl's seed storage, which he had been selecting and saving since 1963. The variety had no commercial name. It was simply Carl's wheat. It had never been tested for yield at extension rates because Carl had never entered it in extension trials. The seed itself was in cloth bags in the bottom drawer of his desk, each one labeled with the harvest year and a note in pencil that indicated what Carl had selected for that season. Dry year select, heavy protein, long root, late fill strong. He had not been selecting toward a commercial target. He had been selecting toward resilience, toward the individual plant that stayed upright when its neighbors went down, toward the head that filled grain even when the moisture ran short in July. 70 years of that selection pressure had produced something the Extension Service had no category for, a variety that was not uniform, not certified, not comparable to any registered cultivar, but that carried in its genetic variation a range of responses to stress that no single-line breeding program could replicate. Some plants in a given year would underperform the extension standard. Others, particularly in dry years, would exceed it. The population averaged out to something less than peak yield and considerably more than peak resilience. Dale Pruitt did not know about the well. He learned about it at the Meade County Ag meeting in January of 2004, when Nora presented her drill log and installation plan to the County Conservation Board in response to a request for local water management examples. He sat in the third row. He listened with the careful attention of a man whose professional identity had just encountered something his folder did not account for. "You hit a perched confined lens," he said when she finished. His voice was not hostile. It was the voice of a man doing rapid recalculation. "Yes," Nora said. "I didn't survey to that depth." "I know." There was a pause. "What was the production rate?" 14 gallons per minute. Pruitt wrote this down. He did not say anything further that evening, but he stayed after the meeting ended and asked if he could review Ed Ferris's drill log. She gave him a copy. He nodded for a long time over it. "Your grandfather noted this in his journal," she said. "Not the depth, just the behavior of the grass." Pruitt looked at her. Something in his expression shifted, not humiliation, but the particular adjustment that happens when a good-faith scientist realizes that the data he carries is not the only data that exists. Meanwhile, 2 miles north, Nora's neighbor Gary Knoll had done exactly what Pruitt recommended. Gary was 41, direct, not a man who wasted time on uncertainty, and he had bought a center pivot irrigation system in 2001 using a federal program loan, drilling a high-capacity well into the main Ogallala Formation at the same time. The loan was $460,000 over 15 years, and the annual payment came to $32,000, which Gary had calculated he could service on the yield premium from 160 irrigated acres running at the extension projection of 42 bushels per acre. His rig pulled 280 gallons per minute and covered the 160 acres in a circle that his daughter could see from the highway. He was widely regarded in the county as one of the better managed operations in the Southwest Quarter, and he was not wrong to be regarded that way. The system was modern, well-maintained, and based on the best projections available. Gary was a good farmer inside the system he had built. The trouble with the system was what the system assumed. It assumed the aquifer would hold. It assumed fuel costs would not run ahead of commodity prices. It assumed no season would arrive that required more water than the well could produce against a crop that needed it all at once. Gary grew hard red winter wheat at extension-recommended seeding rates with extension-recommended fertilizer applications and extension-recommended fungicide programs. His yields from 2001 through 2009 averaged 41 bushels per acre on his irrigated ground, which was strong, and his operating costs averaged $112 per acre per year in the water, fuel, and chemical inputs. When wheat ran at $5.50 a bushel in 2007 and 2008, the margin was comfortable. When it dropped to $4 in 2009, he was still making the payment, barely, and he told himself it was a correction and that the fundamentals were sound. They were sound. Until 2012. Nora's cost on the 80-acre drip system averaged $67 per acre per year. Her yields on Carl's wheat, which the drip system brought to consistently available soil moisture across the root zone, averaged 32 bushels per acre through the same period, which looked worse than Gary's 41 until you accounted for the input differential and the price premium she received for the heritage variety from the Stone Mill bakery operation that had been seeking a specific protein content and baking quality she happened to produce. Carl's wheat had never been bred for yield. It had been bred by 70 years of selection pressure and patient attention to which heads performed in dry years for deep root extension and protein concentration. The regional Stone Mill bakery operation was called Prairie Table, run by a woman named Ruth Hollis out of Pratt, Kansas, who had been looking for years for a hard, red winter wheat with protein content above 14% and a specific flour extraction quality that industrial milling had largely eliminated from the market. She had driven to the Hess place in the fall of 2004 after a bread-baking cooperative in Wichita sent her a sample loaf made from Nora's first commercial harvest. Ruth held a handful of Carl's wheat heads for a long time before she said anything. Then she asked Nora how long the variety had been in development. Since 1963 at the earliest, Nora said. Probably longer. Ruth sent the grain to a laboratory in Manhattan, Kansas, for protein and gluten quality analysis. The results came back at 14.7% protein with a high extensibility rating, which she said meant the dough behaved in ways that allowed a baker to develop crumb structure without the additives that industrial flour required. She offered $1.40 per bushel over commodity price, and she asked for a standing contract for however much of the harvest Nora could consistently deliver. Nora said she could deliver between 2,000 and 2,400 bushels in a good year and between 1,600 and 2,000 in a difficult one. Ruth said that range was acceptable and that the consistent quality mattered more than the volume, and that she had not received consistent quality from any commercial supplier in 3 years. The stone mill operation paid her $1.40 per bushel over commodity price, which on an average year moved her net margin from roughly break-even to $31 per acre after all costs. That was not spectacular. It was enough. What it was, more importantly, was stable. Then came the summer of 2012. The drought that arrived in June of 2012 was the kind of event that hydrologists mark as a reference year for subsequent calculations. Meade County received 6.8 inches of precipitation between April and August, against a historical average of 18.2 inches for the same period. Ground temperature in the top 6 inches of soil reached 114 degrees Fahrenheit on 6 separate days in July. The Ogallala surface elevation dropped faster in that season than it had in any comparable period since the 1930s, and high-capacity well pumps across the county were pulling air by late August. Gary Knowles' center pivot pump ran continuously through June and July, trying to keep pace with evapotranspiration rates that the system had not been designed to offset. His fuel bill for those 2 months came to $14,000. His well output dropped from 280 gallons per minute to 190 by August 1st, as the local water table around his well bore fell below optimum depth. He made the decision in late July to let 60 of his 160 irrigated acres go without water for the remainder of the season, choosing to protect the 100 acres closest to his farmstead. The 60 unprotected acres yielded 9 bushels per acre. The protected 100 averaged 22. His blended average for the irrigated ground was 17 bushels. His dry land acres, which he had not irrigated, averaged 8. The county average for Meade County wheat in 2012 was 11 bushels per acre. Nora's drip system ran at its normal rate through the drought. The confined lens, fed by fractured drainage from the limestone ridge rather than by the surface formation, did not decline in 2012 in any way she could measure. The ridge was dry on the surface, as everything was dry, but its subsurface drainage pattern continued because the fracture network below the limestone cap did not depend on seasonal infiltration the way an unconfined aquifer did. It depended on a longer recharge cycle, measured in decades, not seasons. The drought was 1 season. Carl's wheat, selected over 70 years for root depth in dry conditions, extended its root mass into the soil horizon below the drip emitters, accessing residual moisture in the subsoil that shallow-rooted varieties could not reach. Nora had added no supplemental inputs in 2012 that she had not used in any prior year. She had done nothing outside the pattern she had inherited. She had simply continued to do what Carl's journals, the confined lens and 40 years of inherited observation, had prepared her to do. She harvested 38.6 bushels per acre on the 80-acre drip system in August of 2012. 38.6. That number needs a moment of silence around it, because the county average that year was 11, and Gary Knowles' irrigated average was 17, and Dale Pruitt, who had begun driving past the Hess place twice a year on his survey routes after the 2004 meeting, was one of the people who heard it read aloud from the harvest certificate and did not speak for a full 3 seconds. The number did not mean that Nora was a better farmer than her neighbors. It meant that the system she had managed was built for this specific event. It meant that 60 years of observation, recorded in cardboard-covered journals, had located a water source that the standard survey protocol missed, and that the water source was connected to a geological feature that the drought could not reach in a single season. It meant that a wheat variety selected across 7 decades for dry year resilience had been given, for the first time in its history, consistent moisture delivery at root depth, and that the combination of those two inherited systems, the water and the seed, had produced a result that no single component of the system could have produced alone. Carl had not designed this. Nora had not designed it either. She had assembled it from what she had been left, paying attention at each step to what the ground was telling her, making decisions that were conservative by the conventional ledger and decisive by the one she had inherited. Cobb was there at the edge of the cut field when the combine made its last pass. He was 14 years old by then, heavy in the joints, but he had come out from the porch when he heard the engine, and he sat in the stubble in the late-day light while Nora drove. He was always there for the harvest. He had been there for every harvest since Jake. The county extension office, which maintained yield documentation for crop insurance purposes, sent a field agent named Sarah Colby to verify the harvest certificate before they would process it. Sarah was 28 and had been in the county 3 years, and she had not seen a number like Nora's come off any private operation in Meade County that season. She arrived with a measuring tapes and a grain moisture tester, and she walked the field twice. 38.6, Sarah said, reading the certificate. Yes, Nora said. On what water source? Nora showed her the drill log and the drip system schematic. Sarah was quiet for a moment, looking at the formation depth, at the gallon per minute figure, at the ridge line to the northeast. The ridge is yours? Sarah asked. Always has been. Sarah filed the certificate without adjustment. She also that same week called Dale Pruitt, who was still with Extension, and who had, in the 9 years since the Meade County Ag meeting, made a point of driving past the Hess place twice a year on his survey routes. Pruitt arrived in September. He was 56 now, wearing the same kind of clean company boots he had always worn, but he left them at the edge of the field this time and walked in work boots he had borrowed from his truck. It was a small thing, but Nora noticed it. He spent 2 hours with the drill log, the formation data, and Carl's journals, which Nora brought to the kitchen table under the lamp. He read the 1961 and 1969 entries twice. He read Nora's own first journal entry from 2003, written the week after the well came in, which described the formation depth, the production rate, and a note she had added at the bottom in her own hand. Ridge must stay. Your grandfather noticed this in 1961, Pruitt said. He noticed the grass. He didn't know what it meant. He just wrote it down. Pruitt was quiet for a moment. Hazel was under the table, and he reached down absently and rested his hand on her side while he looked at the journal page. Then he said it plainly. I should have surveyed to 400 feet. My protocol stops at 250 for a residential and farm assessment. That was the wrong protocol for this formation type. It was not a dramatic admission. It was the kind of thing a careful scientist says when the evidence is clear and the honesty is not optional. He said it plainly, and he meant it. Nora did not respond to it directly. She poured him coffee. He told her, before he left, that he was going to write up the confined aquifer assessment as a supplemental protocol for Western Kansas survey work, and that he wanted to include her formation data and Ed Ferris's drill log with her permission, and that he would attribute the identification of the formation to the observational record in Carl's journals. He wanted to be precise about that attribution. He said it mattered to get it right. That fall, Gary Knoll came by the Hess place for the first time since before Jake died. He arrived on a Saturday morning in October and stood in the kitchen with his hat in his hands, which was a gesture Nora had not seen from him before. He was not ruined. He was not in foreclosure. The 2012 season had cost him the margin he had been building for 3 years and had drawn down his well to a production level that made the center pivot payment arithmetic uncertain for the next 18 months. He had been talking to the Farm Credit Office, and he had options, none of them clean. He stood in the kitchen and looked at the journals and at the formation data and said less than 10 words during the whole visit. What he said before he left was this: "Can I come back when Ed Ferris is here?" Nora said yes. Ed Ferris came back in October. He walked Gary's parcel to the east and north, looking for ridge drainage patterns, and found a secondary limestone shelf that he thought might support a smaller lens at a shallower depth. He was not certain. He told Gary the probability was perhaps 40%, and the cost was $20,000 against a 40% chance. Gary thought about it for 2 weeks and then said he would drill. They hit a lens at 312 feet, producing at 9 gallons per minute, which was not enough for a center pivot, but was enough if Gary converted to a partial drip system on his best 80 acres to run a sustainable, reduced input program. Gary converted in 2013. He paid for the conversion partly by selling the center pivot rig to an operation in the north of the county. Nora helped him plant Carl's wheat on 20 acres in 2013 as a trial. She gave him seed at cost and told him the variety was not certified and not covered under any extension trial, and that he was on his own if it failed. It did not fail. It averaged 33 bushels per acre in 2014 against his remaining conventional wheats, 27, and he planted it on 60 acres in 2015. She began keeping the seed log the way Carl had kept it, noting which heads she selected from each season and why, adding her own observations alongside his. The entries were in different handwriting, 60 years apart, and she kept them in the same cardboard-covered journal from the same desk. By 2016, 3 other operations in the county had contacted Nora about the seed and about the confined aquifer assessment protocol that Pruitt had by then written up with Nora's and Ed Ferris's data as a supplement to the standard Ogallala survey. Pruitt had presented it at an extension conference in Wichita. He acknowledged in the paper's introduction that the formation type had been identified through a multi-decade observational record kept by a non-specialist farmer. He used the word observational with the care of a scientist who understood that the word was not a diminishment. She sold seed at cost to 4 operations in 2016 and 2017. She did not scale. She did not take investment. She did not pursue certification for the variety because certification would have required uniformity testing, and the variety's strength was its variation, the genetic range that allowed some individual plants to do better in wet years and other plants to do better in dry years. And that range was precisely what Carl's 40 years of individual head selection had preserved rather than narrowed. Pruitt asked her once in 2017 why she had not pursued a heritage variety registration that would have allowed commercial sale at premium. She told him that Carl's wheat was not a commercial product. It was a working tool for this piece of ground, and she was not interested in it becoming something else. If the neighbors wanted it, they could have it at cost, and they could manage it, and she hoped they kept notes. She was 46 years old that year. Cobb had died in 2014, in his sleep on the porch, in a warm October. She had buried him beside the fence post at the corner of the eastern drip field, where he had always waited for her to come in from the combine. She had a younger healer now, a female she called Hazel, who had her father's one torn ear by coincidence and who slept across the farmhouse door. Nora's daughter, Meg, was 22 in 2017 and had just finished an environmental science degree at Kansas State. She had grown up on the Hess place, but had gone to school, certain she would not come back to it, certain that the farm was a beautiful thing her mother managed, and not a thing she wanted to manage. She had been offered a position with a water quality consulting firm in Denver. She had not yet decided. In the summer of 2017, Nora sat with Meg at the kitchen table and put Carl's journals in front of her without comment. Meg read for an hour. Then she picked up the journal Nora had begun in 2003 and read that too. She asked 3 questions. She asked how the confined lens recharged. She asked what the protein content of Carl's wheat actually measured and whether it had been assayed formally. She asked whether the ridge was mapped under any conservation easement. Nora answered all 3. The lens recharged from fracture drainage below the limestone cap, which meant it depended on the ridge above staying intact and unbroken, which meant the ridge was not idle ground. It was the infrastructure of the whole water system. The protein content had been formally assayed. Ruth Hollis had seen to that, and it had consistently returned between 14 and 15% across 13 harvest years. The ridge was not under easement. It was protected only by Nora's ownership and her intention not to sell it. That last answer sat in the room for a moment. Meg was quiet for a long time. Then she said that the Denver job was probably not going anywhere in 6 months. She stayed through the fall. She drove survey stakes on the ridge with Nora and contacted the County Conservation District about a permanent easement that would prevent any future owner from breaking the surface of those 40 acres, which, in the confined aquifer formation, amounted to protecting the water source. The process took 4 months, required a hydrological assessment that Ed Ferris signed off on, and cost $3,000 in legal and filing fees. The easement was filed in March of 2018. It was a legal document, plain and binding, and it said nothing about heritage wheat or old journals or what a man had noticed about grass in 1961. It said what the ridge was worth in hydrological terms, which was enough for the law even if it said nothing about the other things the ridge was worth, which were harder to put in a document. Meg also, in that first year, formally assayed a broader panel of Carl's wheat for genetic diversity, working with a plant genetics laboratory in Manhattan through a research arrangement Dale Pruitt helped her arrange. The results confirmed what the bread bakers and the dry year yields had suggested for years. The variety carried a population-level variation in drought response genes that represented, in the laboratory's language, a genetically diverse landrace with local adaptation characteristics. In the language Nora used, it was wheat that had been selected by a careful man to do well on this ground in hard years, and it did. Meg began keeping her own entries in the seed log in 2018. Her handwriting was smaller and more angular than Nora's, which was more angular than Carl's, and the 3 hands ran down the pages of the journals like a conversation held across 69 years about what this particular piece of ground wanted and what it would give if you listened carefully enough to ask the right questions. What Dale Pruitt had carried into that kitchen in April of 2003 was not wrong. His data on the Ogallala was accurate. His protocol was standard. His recommendation followed logically from everything he had been trained to measure. What his folder could not carry was the 60 years of observation that a man had made with his eyes on the grass and his hands in the soil. The kind of knowledge that does not compress into a survey depth and does not register on a drawdown curve because it belongs to a different scale of time and attention. 2 kinds of knowing exist, and they are not enemies of each other. Dale Pruitt understood by 2018 that his survey instrument and Carl's journals were not contradictory. They were measuring different things. The survey measured the formation as it existed under the standard assumptions of standard practice. The journals measured what happened when a particular human being paid attention to a particular piece of ground for 4 decades and wrote down what he saw without knowing what it meant yet. The survey told you what to expect. The journals told you what to look for. Both are necessary. What the journals cannot survive is the assumption that the survey is sufficient. What the surveys cannot supply is the 60 years of patient attention that tells you where to look that the survey does not go. What is rigid in the face of drought breaks. What is adaptive endures. The distinction is not visible until a structural shock applies the test, and by then the time for preparation has passed, which is why the preparation has to happen in ordinary seasons, in ordinary years, in the form of small, quiet observations written into a cardboard-covered journal under a lamp by a man who did not know he was leaving something of value. Hazel was at Nora's feet the evening Meg signed the easement papers at the kitchen table. The lamp Jake had wired was still working. The journals were stacked at the end of the table where Carl had kept them. Outside the window, the eastern drip field was quiet in the early dark, and somewhere below it, at 382 feet, the water that the ridge sent down through 40 years of patient filtration moved slowly through the limestone toward the emitters that would carry it, come August, into the roots of Carl's wheat. The ground remembered what it was given. The question was always whether anyone was paying close enough attention to notice what it gave back.